What's going on, guys? Andrew of New Bark Gaming back here today with another Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains discussion video. Now, as most of you know, I took a little bit of a gap between recording Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So with that being said, the latter chunk of Season 1 as well as the early halves of Season 2 were basically things I never really voiced my thoughts on and haven't really had too much of a chance to voice on in reviews either, because I don't want to make them stupidly long, catching you up on my thoughts on what happened in those seasons. So this is going to be one of a couple videos I use to kind of bridge the gap between where I left off reviewing the first time and where I picked up again this time. So that being said, let's go and jump right into it. Today we're going to be talking about my general thoughts on Season 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains. Now, Season 1 as a whole I thought had an incredibly strong start. There was a lot of mystery surrounding the loss incident, which left us curious. We had some interesting side characters introduced in Go Onizuka, Aoi, Revolver, etc. So we had a good supporting cast. Yusaku seemed like he was an interesting enough protagonist, and there certainly seemed like there were opportunities being set up in his duels to maybe where he could lose and face some humanity, which is something that I personally always look for in my Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonists, especially considering they have a tendency to be a little extra Mary Sue-ish. I feel like they haven't been quite as bad with it lately. I would say Yusei was kind of the last rough example, but even Yusei faced some challenges he had to overcome, such as when he lost to Kiryu. I would personally side with the worst example being a Mary Sue being Jaden. But anyway, pressing onward from that, I thought it had an extremely promising premise. Now, the problem became, I felt the further we pressed onto the season, the more it felt to me like they didn't really have a full idea of even where they wanted the plot to go from to begin with. So it almost sort of reminds me of a lot of the people who hate Star Wars The Last Jedi, the kind of backlash that they gave it. One of the big complaints was that the movie doesn't piece very well together with The Force Awakens. A lot of the things J.J. Abrams was trying to hint at and such, some people would argue that Rian Johnson just threw that away. I'm not going to get into that because this is not a Star Wars movie review channel, but that's kind of the parallel that I feel like I would say happened in Vrains here. We had a lot of mysteries set up with the Lost incident. We had a lot of characters set up to be really strong duelists, such as Go and Aoi, that never ended up actually doing much of anything in terms of being significant to the plot. We had random interruptions and characters just introduced that were supposed to be significant to the Knights of Hanoi, but basically showed up for like 2 or 3 episodes and then didn't do anything. I mean, basically all of Revolver's supporting members except for Spectre showed up for a single episode, such as Byra, then lost, and then disappeared again. Speaking of which, that episode chain is one of the things that bothered me most about Vrains, because we had those new Knights of Hanoi that just showed up and lost, and then you also had these as being your pass-off or excuses to be able to give a win to Go and Aoi respectively. That was supposed to be plot relevant, but once more, the fact that those characters kind of appeared and then were just sort of skimmed over made it feel to me like it wasn't very plot relevant at all. And then it was supposed to be a big deal of, oh, they defeated some of the upper ends of the Knights of Hanoi, etc., etc. Well, if they were so high up, why had we never met them before that? So moving on from that, after that kind of episode chunk where it was, there's new knights, now they're going to lose to our supporting cast, and then we're going to get back to the plot that you actually cared about. After that chunk of the show, I thought we got some pretty good stuff again. I liked the way that they set up Revolver to be an incredibly strong duelist, in that Go actually had a pretty interesting duel against him. I mean, he had a couple of times where you genuinely could believe, particularly if you aren't used to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Formula for shows, so to speak, that Go may have won. But Revolver ended up destroying him anyway. I also really enjoyed the throwback they made to the original series during those duels, and that Revolver's ace card, so to speak, was Mirror Force. That card has been around since when the show and the card game first debuted, so to see it have a shining moment again, I think it was a really good callback to us older fans who have been with the show since the beginning. Now, adding on to that, I do think it was a little bit disappointing not to have Go, once more, have a major win. Yeah, he beat one of Revolver's, he beat the guy with green hair that worked with Revolver, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. But once more, there was nothing set up to make us feel like that character was powerful. I'm sorry, Dr. Genome, that's the name I'm looking for. There was nothing set up to make us feel like Dr. Genome was powerful to begin with. So then, moving on from that, our kind of parallel duel we had running to that, because Playmaker ends up cleaning up the mess for both of them, was when Aoi faced Spectre. Now, I would personally argue this was the more interesting of the two duels. At most, what you had going on in Revolver versus Go was that Go showed off that he can do some cool combos with his deck, but we all kind of knew he probably wasn't going to win anyway. Aoi, I would say, out of those two, probably had the slightly better shot at winning, because it would have at least been possible for her to defeat Spectre, then end up going up against Revolver herself and losing. I honestly feel like that may have been a slightly more interesting route, but I was more okay with the way this character arc went, because regardless, you were building up either a supporting antagonist or a supporting protagonist to be a better duelist than they were before. So anyway, moving on from that, the character development we got here on Spectre I thought was very interesting. We got to see a different perspective on the Lost Incident, even if I do believe it's one that's a lot harder to sympathize with, and that Spectre adored it. It managed to get him out of an orphanage where he was generally miserable. It gave him dueling. It connected him to the monsters that he cared so much about, such as that mother tree that tree that he more or less considered his mother. And as a result, he's stuck by Revolver ever since for his involvement in the Lost Incident. So that being the case, I thought that made Spectre somewhat of a genuine antagonist. Honestly, at this point, I'm enjoying him more as an antagonist than I am Revolver, and I think that was the case throughout Season 1 as well, primarily because the way Revolver had been set up to me, at least in the early chunks of Vrains, was that he was more or less supposed to fill in our rival character role for the show, versus Spectre was set up from the beginning to be an antagonist. So with that being the case, I felt like they kept making us feel like they were going to go the usual route of Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of making it so that the rival ends up coming around and having a really satisfying change of heart on things, but Revolver never really had that. He never changed his mind on things, and so maybe it's just me, but I felt like the writing on him was a little bit awkward. Perhaps it was just me trying to force the archetype of being the Yu-Gi-Oh! Rival onto him that ends up aiding the main character. But that's the main reason I ended up leaning towards Spectre. I also thought Spectre's backstory, while it does show him to be somewhat twisted, that twistedness comes from like a series of circumstances that could result in someone being like that in an understandable manner. He essentially had a horrible childhood and upbringing that left him where he basically only had dueling and the Lost Incident to lean on for hope. Now, the conversations between him and Aoi during that duel I also found to be really awesome. The fact that he was referencing the story of the Blue Angel, we figure out where Aoi's name comes from, and the fact that Spectre to me was almost reaching out to Aoi in a sense. Now, I know most of it was kind of him being condescending towards her and whatnot, but hear me out on this. The way he was kept going back to a story that he felt they both could connect to came across to me as him doing this sort of attention grab to her. Like, hey, I feel like crap. This is... I relate to you on the inside, but I'm going to insult you on it because this is me putting up a wall. It makes me almost wonder if Aoi wouldn't have been struggling with similar insecurities in some regards herself, or not necessarily similar, but other insecurities herself. If maybe by reaching out, she could have gotten through to Spectre at least a little bit. But that obviously didn't end up happening. But regardless, I found it to be interesting dialogue because there did seem to be a little bit of a connection between the two, even if it was subtle. I wouldn't be surprised if they were to speak again later on in the show, and have like a decent conversation, if maybe there does start to be, once more, just a little bit of a connection and bond between them. Seeing Aoi lose that duel, though, while I would rather see her lose, or while I enjoyed the fact that Spectre got developed, those are the words I'm looking for, I was somewhat disappointed to see her lose again because I felt like she was lacking that big win. Speaking of supporting cast members that I was really frustrated with the route they ended up going with, Emma. Literally, she didn't have a single duel win on screen. And she's supposed to be this top-level Cyverse treasure hunter, and we don't even see her pull out a victory on screen in a world where dueling determines how good you are, how strong, how influential you are when you're in Vrains. That's pretty sad if you ask me, and especially considering she has a really cool deck. As someone who casually plays the TCG, Altergeists are a neat deck. The way that they run traps, they make and just kind of float into each other. They aren't big on attacking, etc., etc. They're just a neat deck to watch in action. So to see Ghost Girl, who honestly I thought to be one of the more interesting characters in premise, at least going into that, basically fall apart into someone who, while she's good at gathering information and good at setting people up, doesn't really have the dueling skills to back it up enough that she manages to ever be super significant to the events that are going on, other than as kind of a catalyst, if you will, and not the biggest catalyst to begin with. So moving on from some of my complaints that we have about the characters, that's going to kind of bring us into the latter chunk of the season. Now, the episode that I was really hoping was going to turn my thoughts around for me in terms of somewhat disliking the latter chunks of season 1 for Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains was when Yusaku and Revolver end up meeting in person. Because that seemed like it was going to be a really interesting event. I honestly was thoroughly believing that maybe we were going to see a duel between them in real life. They were actually going to duel outside of Link Vrains, settle their dispute there. I thought maybe that could happen. I thought it was very possible that maybe, Yusaku manages to get through to Revolver and they end up teaming up against Dr. Kogami. I thought that could have been possible. Sort of similar to what we saw in the end of Zexal. I feel like I'm always referencing Zexal with the show. When we had Yuma and Kite and Shark, all of whom sort of had some somewhat different perspectives on things, end up teaming up in order to take down Dr. Faker at the end of season 1, despite the fact that Kite seemed to be working with Dr. Faker to some extent, at least throughout the events of season 1. So that would have been cool to see them, team up against Dr. Kogami, but Revolver then maybe turn around and then be like, hey, I disagreed with my father's way of handling this, but I still agree with his end game, and you disagree with me on that, so now we have to duel. It could have been almost like when Yuma and Shark worked together to take down Don Thousand, and then after that, Yuma's like, great, so we're friends again, and Shark's like, no, coexistence isn't that simple, buddy. Unfortunately, for me to do what I have to do for the Baryons, I have to destroy you because you're in my way. Something sort of like that between Revolver and Yusaku I think could have been great to watch play out as a character dynamic, but instead we saw both of them kind of continue to be the edgy, somewhat spiteful and vengeful characters from the past that we had seen them be developed throughout season 1, or honestly lack of development if you ask me. And so they end up just dueling as you would expect them to. Playmaker does reach to Revolver a couple times to try and get through to him and be like, hey, you realize you're not just destroying Ignis's, right? You're shutting down the entire network, which could put thousands, millions more lives at risk as a result of all the other systems going down with it. And hey, I've got an Ignis right here and he seems to be getting along with me perfectly fine. Are you sure that this is the answer? So we saw a little bit of progression in terms of Yusaku not just being outright hateful to Revolver, which we found out in season 2 was probably because they did have a little bit of a connection as kids and seemed to have bonded a little bit over dueling prior to the events of the Lost incident, even if maybe Revolver was just baiting Yusaku into knowing him some so he could pull him into the Lost incidents events when they were kids, but that's a different subject for a different day. So I feel like there was a lack of character development to some extent on both ends there. Yusaku's I'm much more okay with because it was a little bit of development. I feel like in season 2 they've continued to build on his character somewhat. He's not quite as bent on revenge, and he's not quite as edgy, and he does seem a little bit more open to friendship now that he's met Soulburner. So when you've got a show that you figure is probably going to run about 150 episodes, especially for a character that gets so much on screen time like Yusaku, dragging out their character development is mostly okay with me, so that didn't sit too uneasy with me. But the fact that Revolver never seemed to stray at all from his father's perspectives, I felt made his character a little bit bland. I could understand what he was going through to some extent. I could relate to his frustrations and hatred, but the fact that there didn't seem to be very much mix in his perspectives on anything, I found to be somewhat frustrating. And I'm hoping with the way this three-sided war is beginning to set up in terms of season 2, that maybe this is going to be when he starts to find some sort of split in his perspective on things. He starts to have some conflict within himself and not just have this singular unified goal, because honestly, a character that clearly and decisively only wants one thing, and they're 100% set on that, and they'll do anything for it without anything to distract them or get in the way or anything that's holding them back from going after that goal. Any hesitations towards it oftentimes proves to be rather one-dimensional and somewhat boring to watch, which is why Revolver, I keep hoping, is going to do things. If we look at older Yu-Gi-Oh shows, Seto Kaiba often seemed rather one-dimensional, but then he had these little twists, these subtle hints that would reveal there's more to him than that. And that's part of what I think always made Kaiba's character more satisfying. And I find most of the time when I end up finding myself disappointed in Revolver, it's because he's set up for these moments that maybe he hints there isn't quite this extreme resolve and unidirectional thought process to him. I'm hoping maybe there's something more to it than that. Like, perhaps we could have had one time where he had the opportunity to eliminate Playmaker, and instead he just leaves him defeated somewhere. I mean, obviously that specific opportunity wasn't shown within Season 1, and a specific instance isn't coming to mind right off my head, but I can think of generally one of my issues just being that Revolver never had those little subtle moments like Kaiba did. Or, then we've got other rivals from other shows, most of which have been on the friendlier side in recent shows, or characters like Zane, who were almost like mentor types of characters. Regardless, we've had these multi-dimensional groups, and now Revolver's both the rival and the antagonist in one, and I'm just not sure how I feel about that on the whole. Moving back to the whole thought process of Yusaku's screen time, that was one of the other issues I really felt we had with Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains Season 1, was as a result of Yusaku getting so much screen time and being involved in all but, say, 4 or 5 duels in the entire Season 1, it made it so the rest of the characters just felt like they were constantly off to the side. As on the whole, it reminded me a little bit of when you're watching, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX and that Jaden's kind of shoved down our throats. Now, I like Yusaku a little bit more than I liked Jaden, which certainly helps with things, but it's not a good sign considering, for me as a viewer, considering if this is starting to remind me a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, considering that, in my opinion, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX is the one I enjoy the least of all the Yu-Gi-Oh! Shows by quite a bit. So I hope they improve some on that, and Season 2 seems to be working on it a little bit by having added in Soul Burner and kind of splitting the time between those two, but that also raises a concern that's similar to GX that I'll probably end up making another video on, in that it doesn't fix your lack of focus on side characters to introduce a single side character and then just split your focus between those two, because then you have the issue of, well, there's still Aoi, there's still Go, there's still Revolver, there's still Ghost Girl, that are getting so little attention. And that's one area where I thought the early episodes definitely were handling it to some extent better than the latter half of the season. Sure, the latter half of the season had these other characters more involved in duels, but there was more mystery and attention paid to developing them in our eyes. Maybe that was just my take on the show early on, but that was the way I felt. I mean, Akira seemed really significant to the plot. Aoi, she was struggling with some things, which seemed to be a competent duelist who was kind of caught in the middle of the struggle between Yusaku and the Knights of Hanoi, so you had to figure out where exactly she was going to fall on that, when she would act, because we all kind of assumed from the beginning she would probably end up fighting in some way against them. Then you had Go, who had offered to be an ally to Yusaku early on, but also deep down really just wanted to defeat Yusaku again, but knew that he was fighting on the right side. So they had a good setup going on there, and just, if it sums up my thoughts in Season 1 into like one sentence, I'm just really disappointed in how they handled the majority of the cast after such a strong intro. It felt almost like if you took Arc 5's issues and crunched them up with fewer bright sides. It was kind of like Arc 5, the first season of Arc 5, I would argue, is probably the best written any season or run of episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has ever been, with only a few being able to keep up with that. But then as you dragged on into the Synchro arc, then you kind of had this interruption of things where there was still a lot of good going on, but it was starting to hint at some of the weirder stuff, but you figured, okay, this is just more set up towards what we'll eventually get. And then in the latter half, you kind of saw them very much needing to force a lot of their side characters back in, and it just felt like they weren't quite as interesting as they once were, at least to me as a viewer. Now granted, I still loved Arc 5, and I don't think it struggled as much as this as Vrains did. Vrains, I feel like it was, here's all these really, really interesting people. Oh yeah, we're just gonna Playmaker duel a bunch, and they aren't gonna do anything super huge to really help out. I mean, if Zexal could freaking have Kite being dead, still manage to help Shark and Yuma take down Don Thousand, I feel like Vrains could have done a better job here. So I think that about concludes my thoughts on Season 1, guys, but hopefully now you understand why it maybe took me a little bit to get back into doing episode reviews, because it was kind of, I took a couple weeks off to kind of catch up on some things, then I just wasn't super enthralled with the show for a while, so I just feel like I didn't have a lot to say other than ranting, and I didn't feel super comfortable ranting at that point, so it was kind of that. And then by the time you got to the latter half of Season 1, there was just a while there where I didn't care. Like, I saw the first episode or two of Season 2, then ended up catching up on those last 15 episodes in these last couple weeks. So with that being the case, I think it's going to about wrap my thoughts up on Season 1. Let me know what you guys thought in the comment section down below. Do you think I'm totally full of crap and that Season 1 was one of the greatest, written seasons of Yu-Gi-Oh! Of all time? Did you think it was kind of okay? Did you agree with most of my points? What do you think they could have done better in it? And what are you hoping they get right in Season 2? I know personally I would really like to see Go become more significant and Aoi become more significant, which they seem to at least be trying to do that by having Aoi on her own side to some extent with Akira and Emma and those types of things. So I'm holding out hope, and hopefully you guys are too. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. If not, constructive criticism is always welcome, and I'll catch you guys next time.